Hello, everyone, and welcome to our introduction to Psych 381 Principles of Learning. So this is an online course, and I wanted to give us a little bit of an introduction to your instructor, me, as well as to the course itself, just so that you know what to expect and where to get started when you're starting this class. So, first things first, who is this random person talking at you in this video and who will be talking at you in all of the videos for the rest of the semester? Hi, I am Dr. Kimberly Campbell. You can call me Dr. Campbell, you can call me Kimberly, both are perfectly acceptable. I do use Kimberly Campbell because there is another Kim Campbell on campus, and she's a little bit more famous than me, so I always use my full first name. So to get started, I always like to explain, first off, why the heck do instructors sit down on the first day and show you their backgrounds? It seems kind of weird to have this list of your academic accomplishments. However, the way that I like to do this is me showing you why I am a reliable source of information for this course. As scientists, we are taught to be critical of the information that we take in, to vet our sources to make sure that they are trustworthy. And so, me telling you about my background, my education, and my research, this is me showing you my experience and telling you why I'm a valid source of information for this course. So very, very briefly, I got a Bachelor of Science with honors and co-op in biology, of all things. I'm not actually a psychologist to begin with. I did my undergraduate research in biology, specifically focusing in on things like genetics and evolution. Though, as part of my co-op placements, I got to work at an animal rehab center, which introduced me to working with corvids, which are very, very intelligent creatures. And it got me asking questions about personality in birds. And of course, when I started looking at doing research, and specifically going on and continuing my education with research, people were telling me that that's not really a biology question. It was far more of a psychology question. And so I came out here to the University of Alberta and I got both a master's and a PhD in psychology looking at birds. Not so much personality in birds, but I do end up studying learning and communication in black-capped chickadees. And this is actually really useful for this class because my methods of discovering how they learn and different aspects of their communication involves operant conditioning, which ends up playing a huge role in this class. So you guys will actually get to learn quite a bit about my research because I'm able to use it as examples when we start getting towards those topics in this course. As an aside, I also did my undergraduate research. I was sequencing DNA to try and identify different single-celled anaerobic organisms in soil samples. So far less exciting and far less relevant to the course. Now, in addition to including sort of my research background, my education background, I like to also include a little bit about me as a person. This is especially important for online classes where you might not have the same kind of interaction with your instructor. So, you've already probably figured out, but I am obsessed with birds. I got sort of very familiar with them, working hands-on with them at that rehab. I then ended up doing research with black-capped chickadees for many, many years, and now I actually have 3 birds at home. So I have 3 conures. You can see 2 of them in the image on the screen here. You will occasionally hear them in the background, though I do try and record when they are either quiet or asleep. But yes, every once in a while they'll sort of chirp in the background. I enjoy making art, and I collect hobbies that are usually fairly creative. So I do things like sketching and painting. I also sew and cross-stitch and crochet and knit and many, many other things. I am terrible at video games, but I absolutely love playing them, mainly older video games. One of my favorites is actually Skyrim, which is quite a few years outdated, possibly at this point decades outdated, but it's still one of my favorites to go back to. I am obsessed with chocolate. I usually have some stashed somewhere on my desk for in between lecture recordings. And you'll notice fairly quickly that I tend to go off on a couple of tangents, and I try and keep those fairly closely related to course content or facts that tie into what we're talking about. But every once in a while, I will intentionally go off on tangents to provide some useful information, which is actually my segue into the first of our tangents. And this is a discussion on how the heck do you address people in academia? And this is a topic that I really wish that I had learned about when I was an undergraduate. And it's one of those things that people in academia understand, but no one ever really explicitly explains it. So I include this tangent in all of my classes. But when you're trying to send an email to an academic, how do you decide how to address that email? The first of these is doctor. So you've heard this already. I talked about me being Dr. Campbell. So this is just somebody who has a PhD. Or if you're working in the medical field, someone who has an MD. So if you see that somebody's education includes a PhD or an MD, then you'd be safe calling them doctor, their last name. Our next two are, instead of degree titles, these are actually hired titles. So this is a position somebody has been given. The first is professor. This is someone, usually someone who also has a doctorate, who has been hired as a professor. So their job title is professor. And in that case, professor, their last name, would also be appropriate. Not everyone who is hired to teach at university is a professor, though. Some of us, myself included, are instructors. So you are still at the university. You may or may not have your doctorate, and you have been hired as an instructor. So for me, doctor is appropriate, instructor is appropriate, but I am not a professor. So Professor Campbell doesn't work. Not yet, anyways. And I also find that instructor, your last name, while it is acceptable, I suppose, it seems kind of weird to me, which is why I go with Dr. Campbell or just my first name. But if we wanted to figure out, well, okay, let's put this into practice. I always use my supervisor, Dr. Sturdy, as my example. So in this case, you can pull up somebody's webpage. If somebody's teaching at a university, there's almost always a find a person category, and it'll list everyone who's employed there. And it'll include information like this. So we can see with Dr. Sturdy, he has a PhD, he also has a master's and a bachelor degree. And so we could call him Dr. Sturdy. We then see that he has been hired as a professor of science, so Professor Sturdy would work as well. Another little tip here, and this is again something I wish I had learned earlier, is that usually you're going to want to go very formal in your first contact. So if I was emailing Dr. Sturdy here, I would say, "Hello, Dr. Sturdy, I read this cool thing and I wanted to ask you a question about it." And then when you look at their response, you can look at their sign-off signature. So how do they sign their emails? And that's usually an indication of what they are comfortable with you using. So I have worked with Dr. Sturdy for long enough that I know that his response is going to be something fairly short, possibly not punctuated, and it's going to be signed Chris. And so in that case, I would say, all right, the next time I'm going to email him, I would probably be fine calling him Chris. So my next email would be, "Hey, Chris, thank you for your reply. Here's a follow-up question." So it's one of those sort of cheat sheets on how to properly interact with others in academia. All right, enough of a tangent. Oop. Next thing, and I guess sort of the last thing that I really want to talk about that's sort of self-serving, is to mention my teaching philosophy. And this is something that I really like including, because if I explain to you why I teach the way that I teach, or why I do things the way that I do them, it actually helps students sort of understand and figure out where I'm coming from with all of those different components. So my first point is that I think the material should be accessible. So you've probably noticed by now, I have possibly the most boring slides ever. And that's because I've intentionally tried to create very high contrast content. I also try and include things like alternate text for images whenever I can. I obviously do lecture recordings for my online courses, and when I teach in person, I still record all of those lectures. I like having that sort of information available for students so that you can go back and rewatch everything. It's also really nice that when I post these on YouTube, they actually create transcripts for all of the videos, which means that if you wanted to have all the information that I've said and copy and paste that into your lecture notes, it's there for you in text format, which is awesome. And I like to include flexibility as much as possible. You'll find that I try and give you information, things like, say, chapter quizzes in advance, and then I try and give you lots of time to choose when you would like to complete those. So I try and integrate flexibility as much as possible. You'll also find that I try and get away from the traditional mindset that in order to succeed in a psychology class, you have to memorize a whole bunch of things. I would much rather focus on teaching you to understand concepts, to think critically, to make connections between concepts. This is one of the reasons why I try and use open book assessments as much as possible. That way, you don't have to worry about memorizing a particular definition. Instead, you would have to understand and use the concept that would have been defined. So that's sort of one of my biggest approaches. I'm trying to teach you to learn how to learn and to try and create the notes and documents and things that are going to help you prepare that information in a way that's useful. I also think that that's a lot more applicable in the real world because it's very infrequent that you have to have lots and lots of definitions memorized. You're probably going to be able to look stuff up. We'll find very quickly as I run through the different components of the course that I like to use multiple sources of assessment. I have seen a lot of courses, especially in psychology, where you end up with 2 midterms and a final exam, and that's it. And that kind of sucks if you're not great at taking multiple choice tests. So I like to include things like chapter quizzes and written assignments, things that are going to allow you to get marks in slightly different ways. And it also helps spread out where all of those marks are coming from, which means that if you do really poorly on, say, your first midterm of the semester, it's not an automatic sort of tanking of your grades. You have that chance to make it up with multiple other sources. And the last point is, again, something you've probably figured out. I like to explain why. I don't just like to throw information at you and say this is the way it is. I like to tell you why something is. So, why I teach the way that I teach, or why I go off on a tangent, or why I have explained my education background. I find that information really useful, and honestly, it helps you remember that information better in the future. So, you'll find a lot of why in this class. So, for this class, to finally get into that, how can you do well in this class? So, I like to stress that you make use of the resources that are available. I'm going to show you our eClass page in just a few moments here, but I like to include lots of information. So I'm going to give you the slides and the recordings, but I will also on occasion have extra links or extra videos to clarify or add to some of the concepts, especially if a bunch of students are finding that concept difficult. For this coming to class is more of a attend the Zoom sessions, which are optional, and again, we'll talk about that in a minute. Come to those if you have questions or if you want to interact. It's going to be a chance for you to ask questions, to get me to go back over content if you have sort of uncertainties. I can give you more examples or whatever. So it allows you to ask questions and also interact with others and with your instructor. Talked about my extra videos and links, and don't hesitate to reach out. If you're not comfortable coming to one of the Zoom classes and you don't necessarily want to talk in that format, you can send me an email. We can meet one-on-one. I will be accessible to you. I have already stressed that I focus on not so much the memorization, but on connecting concepts. And one of the best ways to prepare for that is by making detailed and organized notes, and especially to do that as you go, because those exams are going to creep up on you and you don't want to leave it to the last minute. Also, making those detailed and organized notes will help highlight any concepts that you're not really that certain of, which you can then bring to some of our meetings, so you can ask those questions. Another thing, even though I use open book assessments, it doesn't mean that you can just sort of show up for the exams and hope to do well. I specifically design everything so that you should have a basic understanding of the concepts. You should know how they connect to one another. The notes are going to be there so that you can double check if you forget something, but you won't be able to look up every single thing on an exam. So definitely make sure that you study. Prepare for these exams as if they weren't open book, and it should set you up to do much better on those tests. And again, don't leave it to the last minute, especially when you don't have sort of daily classes to go and attend in person. It gets really easy to push stuff off until the last minute. So try and do things gradually, try and keep up as we go through our schedule, and that'll definitely help. So for our next bit of information, this is going to get into this course in particular. We will go and take a look at our class website. We have eClass. I also teach at other institutions where they use the exact same setup, the same program, I guess, but they all call it something slightly differently. So the base content is actually called Moodle. I might accidentally refer to it as Miscanus because that's what they use at McEwen. But if ever I'm talking about the site, it's eClass. And that's where you're going to be able to find our announcements, the syllabus. I'll also have our slides and recordings and all of our assessment links and all of that useful information. So we'll hop over and look at that in a moment. For the syllabus, that's where you find all that important information. Since this is a 300 level course, I'm not going to pick through the syllabus the same way that I would for, say, an intro course, but I'm going to encourage you, make sure that you read through that syllabus. Make sure you look at all that important information. Write down all of those dates, and it'll show you the breakdown for a lot of the components. I have gone through and picked out some of the highlights from that, which we'll do in the next few slides. That's the main reason why I'm not going through the syllabus with you sort of again. For our lecture content, as you might have figured out since you are listening to this video, all of the lectures are going to be pre-recorded. I find that having that flexibility where you can watch those lectures at any time whenever it's convenient for you tends to work really well for students. I'm going to post them to eClass. I'll be putting them up following the lecture schedule, though if I happen to record a lecture early, I'm not going to hold on to it until we hit that point in the lecture schedule. If I'm done them early, then I'll post them early. But at the very latest, you'll have them for the date that we're supposed to cover it in the class schedule. That being said, we are then also going to have those optional Zoom meetings during the scheduled class time. I find that while the flexibility from asynchronous lectures is really useful, it tends to leave students a little bit disconnected from others in the class and from the instructor. So I like using those scheduled periods for us to sit and chat. We can ask questions, we can talk about content, you can ask about academia in general. And like I said, they're not mandatory. I'm not taking attendance or anything like that, but they're just there as that extra resource. So make use of it if it's going to help you. For our grade components, this is where you're going to see all of those sort of different sources of grades. We do have 2 midterms and a final. I try and keep the weight of those assessments as low as possible. So the midterms are each worth 25%. The final exam is 35%. I don't love those classes where you end up at the end with a final exam that's worth like half your mark, because that can be really nerve-wracking. So this way they're all kind of split out. We also have a written assignment that's going to be worth 10%, and then there are going to be chapter quizzes that should be completed somewhat weekly, though you'll see the deadlines in just a moment for those. But yeah, so a couple of different sources of grades. For the midterm exams, they are going to be 80 minutes long. They're going to be mainly multiple choice questions. I do like to include short answer questions. However, I'm not sure if we are going to have a TA for this course this semester. I haven't heard from the department yet if we have a TA, and if we do not have a TA, I won't be able to grade large amounts of written questions. So that's going to be a tentative inclusion of short answer questions, and I'll be able to tell you in advance of that exam how we're going to divvy it up. I'll also keep you posted on if and when we get a TA. Like I said, 25% each. The midterms are not cumulative, which means that they're only going to cover the new information that's been taught since, say, the last midterm. The final exam will be cumulative, so it's going to be a little bit of everything, but it gets more heavily weighted towards new content yet again. I say here that the questions can come from either the textbook or the lecture material. However, I use the textbook to create my lecture material, and I choose the content that I think is most important to understand for this course. And then when I sit down to make my exams, I typically think about what is the most important concept that we talked about. So mainly it's going to be stuff that is just from the lectures. I might include, say, examples that are coming from the textbook, but if you understand the concepts, the examples aren't necessarily going to throw you for a loop. And these midterms are going to be available through eClass. And what I do with my exams is I typically open up a window where you are able to access them between 8 a.m. and 5 p.m. just so, again, there's some flexibility on when you get to write it. And of course, as we get closer to our midterms, I'll be releasing more of that information and we'll get to talk about it a lot more just so that you're prepared. But just so you know what to expect. Our final exam will be very similar to the midterms. It's 2 hours long. We typically get a 3-hour slot, but I do not love 3-hour exams, so it's just going to be 2-hour exams. Like I said, cumulative, but with far more emphasis on the sort of untested chapters. So it's typically going to be a 30-70 split, where only 30% of the final exam comes from the earlier chapters that were covered on the midterms, because we've already tested that material. The vast majority will be on the new content. And the final exam, we actually don't know the date quite yet. It will be available through eClass, just like the midterms, but it's going to be written during the window that the Office of the Registrar sets for us. So you'll keep an eye on that. They'll usually release a tentative exam date and then finalize it usually around November, but it depends on the year. So again, when I know that date and that time window, I'll let you guys know. And I'll give you the details for the final exam again when we're getting close to the final exam. Our next component, chapter quizzes. So like I said, these are only 5%. They're mostly meant to keep you working through the content at a regular pace and to give you a little bit of exposure to some of these concepts and get you practicing with the types of multiple choice questions that I ask in order to prepare for those midterms. So these are giving us some groundwork so that the midterms aren't a huge surprise. So they're going to be made up of multiple choice questions. They're going to be from content in the text, mostly stuff that we're going to be talking about in class, just like the midterms. Though I do find that because these chapter quizzes are A, open book, B, untimed, and C, something that you can log into and start working on and then log out of and come back to as many times as you want, I'm a little bit more lenient with having the kinds of questions that you might have to look up. So just to keep that in mind, they might have some types of questions that you wouldn't see on an exam. So every once in a while we'll have things like names will creep in. I don't do dates because I can never remember numbers, but you might see stuff that's a little bit more specific than what would show up in an exam situation. I will show you the dates for actually I can do the flipping back and forth. So the way that I do this is I will release the chapter quizzes as we start covering these different chapters. However, I make the quizzes due on the date of the exam that tests that content. So for example, chapters 1 through 4 are going to be on our first midterm. And so those quizzes are due at midnight on the date of our first midterm. The only exception here is the last 4 quizzes are due on the last day of lectures. So that's December 8th. And the reason for this is because I don't actually know when our final exam is, and I needed a date for these. So they will be due on December 8th. So those are important dates to make note of. And for these, they will auto-submit when we hit that deadline. So even if you forgot to go in and hit the submit button, they will auto-save and submit at that deadline. So you don't have to worry about that. I will let you know that there are no late submissions accepted. So as soon as they're finished, they will auto-submit, and that is that. If you have to miss a deadline, please try and get in touch with me in advance or as soon as you can afterwards. And it's one of those, it must be sort of an extreme situation to have missed. All right, so that's our specific dates and the rules for those. We then have our written assignment. And in this case, this is worth 10%. It's going to be due on Sunday, November 12th by midnight. So the reason that I chose this date was I was going to do it on Friday so people didn't leave it until the weekend. However, our second midterm is on the 9th and the 10th is the Friday. So I kind of figured that people wouldn't want to have things due back to back like that. And then I was going to do it the week after, but the week after is reading week. And I really don't want you to have to work on an assignment during reading week. So Sunday is the last day before reading week, but I will encourage you to finish this assignment early so that you don't have to worry about those deadlines. I will be posting and doing a whole walkthrough on this written assignment. I've put here that I'll be posting it after the first midterm has passed. I've already actually planned out most of the details for this assignment, so I'll probably be posting it in the next week or two. And when I do that, I will include a video just like this one where I walk you through the requirements and all of that for the assignment. But I will let you know so that you don't start panicking. The way that I do my assignments is I try and keep them fairly short, and I try and get you to do some critical thinking. So the way that I want to do this one is having you look at some of the content that we've covered in the class and connect it to recent research, and then do some connections between how we've taught it and what the research shows and things like that. And if I go with the way that I'm thinking about it, it's going to be just say 2 or 3 pages long assignment. So it's not meant to be anything huge or intimidating, just to get you, again, finding marks in different sources and thinking critically about some of this content. All right, for our next section here, I've hopped over to our eClass page. And again, I'm not going to go into tons of detail because I'm sure you can read most of this information. And if you found this lecture, then you've already found this site. But I'll just hit some of the highlights just so that you can see it. So at the top here, we just have all of the information that I've copied and pasted from our syllabus, including my email address. You might find that if you search for my name in the email application, it brings up either this email or another one, ki6@ualberta.ca. Both go to the same inbox. This one is just more professional, but the other one works just as well. So I've put in here that we're doing lectures are online with those optional Zoom meetings, and the link to those attendance optional Zoom meetings is right here. So for these, I'm going to start them at 8 a.m. on our scheduled Tuesdays and Thursdays. And the way that I do this is that I guarantee that I'll be around for at least 15 minutes. If nobody is present at that time, if nobody has questions, rather than sitting around and staring at an empty waiting room, I will just end the meeting at that point. If there are lots of students and we're having a good discussion, I have sort of blocked out that entire period all the way up until 9:20 when the class period is supposed to end. So I can stay that whole time if people are interested. I just find that there are periods when there are lots of questions and then some when there are very few. So at least 15 minutes, but I can go longer if people would like. For this, when you click through, I'm not actually sure what it looks like to students because when I click in, it gives me the option to set everything up. But for you guys, you should be able to click in and then access it through the system. The password for this is behavior with the Canadian spelling. And I don't know if it'll prompt you for a password if you log in through eClass like this, but just in case, it's there. And I make a note here that I record these meetings as a precaution, basically to make sure that people aren't acting out or doing anything controversial in the chat, but I don't share those recordings. Again, just a precaution and a protective measure. Here's where you can find our syllabus. Like I said, this is for you to read on your own. You can also access our announcements here, though when I post announcements, they'll also send a copy to your U of A inbox, so just keep an eye out for those. And that'll include things like details for assignments or exams and things like that. So anything important that everyone needs to know about, I'll have them all there. All right, so here is where we have everything else that's really important. So our introduction to the course, starting here, are the slides that I just used to speak to you guys. You guys will also have a link here to this lecture. So there'll be a YouTube link there as well. So that's just going to be our getting started, what to expect. Here's the textbook information. This is a fantastic textbook. Even if you're not a textbook person, I really like this one. The author is very knowledgeable and makes what could be a fairly dry topic fairly interesting. I call this a recommended textbook, specifically because you can get most of the content just from the lectures. I do say recommended because if you are somebody who's going to get information out of a textbook, it's a great textbook to have, and there might be a couple of questions or examples that are going to be paralleled in the text that we didn't quite cover in the lectures, but especially when it comes to our exams, that's going to be stuff that we focused on in lecture. So take that as you will. For our lecture schedule, this is again just copy and pasted straight out of our syllabus. So useful and important dates to write down. So this is our first week. We're covering chapter 1. You can find that link to that lecture already. I did that one first and then did our introduction here. And then next week we'll do chapter 2 and so on and so forth. Our first midterm is on October 5th, covering those first 4 chapters. Midterm 2, November 9th, and that's covering the next 4 chapters. And then the final exam, like I said, to be determined. The Office of the Registrar sets that date, and it's covering all of our chapters. So that is just a quick way to reference that. I will be including our chapter quizzes. This is just from our syllabus, and then underneath here I will be adding chapter 1 and 2 and so on. I'm a little bit behind on chapter 1, but that'll be showing up fairly soon, and then chapter 2 quickly after. This is where I will post all of our examinations, so our 2 midterms and the final exam links will be in there. I will also include a practice exam in that box as well as we get closer. And then underneath that are all of our different chapter topics. So chapter 1, we have that link to our video recording of that lecture, as well as our slides here. So I provide them in both PowerPoint slides and PDFs, depending on whatever your preference is. And then I'll do the same for all of the other chapters as time goes on. I also have one extra section down at the bottom here, just some extra resources. And these are some more accessibility things that I found fairly useful in other classes. So I might add to these as I come up with stuff, but I just figured I'd draw your attention to that. And so that is it. Actually, I'm realizing I don't have a section yet for our written assignment. I'll put that in and populate it when I have that finished up, but it'll go up towards the top here. It'll be pretty easily labeled, so you'll find it but yeah, other than that, one oversight on my part, that's everything for the course. So hopefully this has given you an idea of what to expect and where to find everything and what the process is going to look like. And as I've said, if you have questions, if you want to discuss anything, you can send me an email or you can come by to our attendance optional Zoom meetings, the first of which will be on Tuesday, September 5th. For me, that's tomorrow, but whenever you're listening to this, it might have happened. I'll be in for Thursday, September 7th as well, and every Tuesday and Thursday after that. So if you have questions, that's where you can find me. But yeah, hopefully you're as excited as I am for this class, and hopefully you enjoy this format.